Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Hey, LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates that you want to talk to faster. Did you know that every week, nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your job for free now at linkedin.com/goodseats. That's linkedin.com/goodseats to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And now, here's our show.
New Orleans of the mid-1970s had an indefinable spirit that permeated the city. It was wild, beautiful, and at the same time unpredictable. Into this came the New Orleans Jazz basketball team. Only the second NBA team located in the South, the team became the embodiment of the fun-loving, flamboyant attitudes of New Orleans. As one writer put it, everybody has come back to the old town full of the Jazz, and they promised to knock the fans off their feet with their playing. Indeed, they did. And it was the flashy ball control, passing, and arching jump shots of a true Southern icon, Pistol Pete, that defined the team. The game was fun, and the crowds were equally as fun.
Pete Maravich had the ability to do anything on the basketball court that could be done and that he wanted to do.
Maravich. Boy, he's got all kinds of moves. What move doesn't this guy have, Kel?
Oh, he can do it all. I don't know how you stop a guy like that.
It was just an incredible experience.
Up front to Jimmy McMillan. He drives. Off the glass, no good. Coleman rebounds. That was fine defense by Maravich.
He was the franchise.
Well, what do you say? 27 points for Maravich, and we're 5 minutes, almost 6 minutes from halftime.
It was something else.
Another steal.
We was a close-knit, we was like a family.
First time the Jazz was in. Oh, there's a foul on Beers. Pistol Pete really played, twitched like a fiddle that time.
It was magical.
I tell you, there's such a thing as a law of averages. Pistol will have to cool off pretty soon because he has not missed too many shots this season.
I think he defies that law and a few others sometimes. Otto Moore gets fed in the post, back to the Pistol, goes on a drive right to the basket. It is good, and he's fouled.
I don't know how you stop him. He is too much.
Cal, I don't know about you, but I'm running out of things to say about Maravich.
You can fly through the air with the greatest of ease.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, now, welcome. How is it going, everybody? My name's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available. Happy 2022. Hope it's going well for you so far. It's a new year, and we continue in our, I guess, 5th year or so of this extravaganza that we like to call Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Hope you had good holiday tidings, and you're still standing and you're still staying healthy and watching out for the latest variant in this medical curse that just seems to be our fate these last couple of years. We're here to help you get through it a little bit with a little diversion. This week is no exception, luckily. Our guest this week is Professor Thomas Aiello, and we're going to be talking about pro hoops and its relationship with the Deep South. And it's a fascinating and a revealing conversation. Tom Aiello is a professor of, let me make sure I get his official title correct. He's professor of history and Africana studies at Valdosta State University down in metropolitan Atlanta. And we're going to be talking about the intersection of professional basketball, hoops, and that and popular culture, race, the Deep South. Certainly that means two cities in particular when it comes to the current day NBA, as well as the, don't forget it, the American Basketball Association. The cities, of course, of New Orleans and Atlanta, the sort of, I guess, the pioneering cities, if you will, of pro basketball. And why it took so long to gain toeholds there. And you can imagine how racial history in the Deep South played a role. And perhaps the greatest of white hopes, as it was positioned back in the day, a guy named Pete Maravich, a very crucial figure in cementing toeholds and footholds, if you will, for pro basketball in both of those cities, Atlanta and, as you heard in that clip, the New Orleans Jazz. Remember them? Yes, kids, the Utah Jazz had a predecessor. It was a handful of years in New Orleans. You ever wonder why the Utah Jazz got their nickname? Well, it's because they domiciled themselves originally in New Orleans, where jazz is actually a real and historical thing. I digress as to why that nickname still stays there. But Pistol Pete Maravich, for you youngins, one of the NBA Best 75, as announced a couple of months ago, was part of the actually NBA Top 50 announced a number of years ago. He will be forever enshrined as one of the greatest basketball players to ever play the game, both not only in the NBA level, but at the collegiate level as well at LSU. But he is a seminal figure in our conversation coming up with Tom Aiello. His book is called Dixieball, Race and Professional Basketball in the Deep South, 1947 to 1979. Lots of subtext and cultural components to this story, but Pete Maravich kind of crystallizes a whole bunch of it. But let me sort of specifically talk about that clip. So that was from a documentary film called The Night of Pistol Pete by Mendelssohn Entertainment Group. I found it on YouTube, of course, like we find a lot of our clips, not all, but most of them. And in particular, it's a wonderful documentary, an hour long, that talks about and commemorates that special night when the night was February 25th, 1977. The broadcast, I think on WOR, Channel 9, Madison Square Garden Productions, was the original broadcast. That's when Pete Maravich dropped 68 points, a record, most ever by a guard at that time, against the New York Knicks, who were not necessarily shrinking violets per se that year. I mean, you had Bob McAdoo, Earl Monroe, Tom McMillan, Walt Clyde Frazier, Bill Bradley, even a young, not so young, Phil Jackson, Dean Meminger was on that team. But to put it in perspective, that game at the New Orleans, actually, I think called the Louisiana Superdome, Pete Maravich was 26 for 43 for 605 field goal shooting percentage, as well as going 16 for 19 from the line for 68 points. And just to put that in perspective, the Knicks that night, McAdoo had 12, McAdoo had 28 points. Earl Monroe had 11. Tom McMillan had 16. Off the bench, Lonnie Shelton for 17. But I mean, Maravich is putting everybody to shame. On the Jazz, however, the only other teammates of his that had double digits were Otto Moore for 10 and Mo Howard, who had 12. Everybody else was in single digits. It was the Pete Maravich show that night, as it was most nights with the New Orleans Jazz, as it was most nights for the original version of the Atlanta Hawks, having just moved from St. Louis prior, and them leveraging the team, if you will, to get Pete Maravich to play there. I don't want to knock Pete in terms of being a team player, but he was a prodigious and unique talent for sure. And as you'll hear in our conversation with Tom Aiello in just a moment, was the, if you will, proverbial great white hope, and all the positive and negative connotations that come with that ideal, that idea. But the reality, I guess, of the management teams of both of those franchises, young and struggling, both of them in the Deep South, that had a long history with basketball and, frankly, also a long history with racism and the realities of trying to market an NBA and be mostly African-American player base in the Deep South. It's a fascinating conversation. It takes us in very interesting directions. You will learn a lot from this conversation, as I did. Our conversation coming up with the professor, Thomas Aiello. He, the author of Dixieball. It's an interesting and fun conversation coming up in a moment's time. How about a little New Year's discount for you with one of our great sponsors, one of our longest sponsors? It's Retro Royals. RetroRoyals.com, formerly known as 503 Sports, but now the sub-brand 503 Sports is RoyalRetros.com is the place to go for, as the name implies, the best in retros from all kinds of teams and leagues in the pro realms, no longer with us for whatever reasons. And why not celebrate with 10% off when you use the promo code SEATS at RoyalRetros.com. They call themselves the king of throwbacks, and for good measure. And one team that you can commemorate this episode with a purchase or 2 or 10 or many as you want at RoyalRetros.com are the New Orleans Buccaneers of the old ABA. They feature into this story as we get into our conversation with Tom in a moment. But the New Orleans Buccaneers were the first pro basketball team to kind of penetrate the Deep South. And you can celebrate by a couple of different versions with the original cool little cartoon-looking pirate guy dribbling a beautiful red, white, and blue basketball. You can get the shirt in blue or in red, and you can also get the New Orleans Buccaneers jersey in white. I think it comes in blue, and in this gorgeous sort of rose-tinted red with the Bucs iconic script signature on it. Get your name on the back if you'd like. Why not? What better way to celebrate not only this episode, but the pioneering history of the New Orleans Buccaneers of the ABA, as well as what came thereafter. The New Orleans Jazz, today's New Orleans Pelicans, the New Orleans Hornets that were sort of there after they were in Charlotte, all that stuff. Let's celebrate a little bit of basketball pioneering in the Deep South with the king of throwbacks at sorry, I keep referring to him as 503 Sports, but they're known as Royal Retros now. And again, it's RoyalRetros.com, promo code SEATS for 10% off, not only your New Orleans Buccaneers stuff, but anything else on the site. And we thank our pal Dustin Alameda at Royal Retros for his continued support of the show. We love him, and we know you will too. All right, let's segue nice and smoothly, shall we, into a wonderful and revealing conversation about basketball and its history in the Deep South, the pro variety. Let's get into it. The author of Dixieball, here he is, Professor Tom Aiello, and let's get into our conversation we had just last week. Happy New Year. Here it is, coming right up. Please enjoy. So let's set the table here. Maybe a little background about your professional life, because you are approaching our little topic this week from more of an academic perspective, but you know, where academia and history and or nostalgia, if you will, kind of overlap. I'm sure they all bleed into each other. But let's at least get a little bit of a sense of sort of the starting point and what, shall we say, qualifies you to be an expert on this particular subject, which I find fascinating.
Right. So it's interesting that sports, not only in the actual athletic side of the university, but also the study of sports history is often looked down on in the academy, just because so many of the people who go into academics kind of shunned sports early on. But I have always kind of been involved in it. My one of my first books was on the Negro Leagues, and I'm still very involved in the advocacy for Hall of Fame status for the Negro Leagues. I've written extensively on that. One of my next books was on the Bayou Classic football game, which is our biggest HBCU football game here in the South between Grambling and Southern at the Superdome every year. I've also, I don't know if you consider it a sport, but I certainly consider chess a sport as well. I've written on chess. I've written on the history of black tennis in the South and its early professionalization. One of my books is on just a compendium of sports in New Orleans more broadly. So I have a long history of doing sports history, and especially dealing with race in sports, because that is one of my main subjects. And I spent a lot of my time, especially dealing with sports in the South, not only because that's where I'm from, it's also the area that I just know the best, historically speaking, and where race has mattered most. I mean, the reason why we're having this conversation in the time period that we're having it is because no professional sports would come here until after the Voting Rights Act. And so I have written several books on these subjects. The book that I think is most qualifying for our conversation today was a book called Dixieball about professional basketball coming to the South, which was a decidedly big deal, considering that of all the professional sports, the NBA and the ABA as well were the two leagues that were most coded racially. And to have them come to the area of the country that was the most coded racially in the other direction was bound to cause a lot of interesting problems.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And football certainly could qualify for that too. And we've kind of danced around the edges of that and how long that took, if you will, and things like George Preston Marshall with the then known as, well, the Washington, what is now known as the Washington football team.
Singing Dixie and everything at the games.
Well, yeah, in essence, kind of, pandering, if you will, to the South. And from a business perspective, right, it made a ton of sense because it essentially ensured for a long time in the NFL's history, the Washington team would be basically the team of the southern region of the country, right? So it was almost sort of protectionism, if you will, for the franchise as a super regional one versus just one in D.C.
No, it was a good idea. And of course, when Dave Dixon...
It's a good idea, except he was a racist. But other than that...
Well, he was an incredible racist. But, I mean, he's playing to an audience in Virginia and Maryland, a predominantly white audience in Virginia and Maryland, who are very much creatures of the South. I mean, there were Sons of Confederate Veterans chapters that went to those games relatively regularly from those two states. So we didn't even have to look far into the South to get that kind of that influence. But as a matter of fact, when Dave Dixon was trying to argue for a pro team for the NFL in New Orleans, and ultimately got it because he facilitated the merger with New Orleans legislators in Congress, the only real holdout pushing back against that was Washington, because they knew that if Southern teams start becoming a thing, they lose that market. And when New Orleans and Atlanta come into the league, everybody was on board. Everybody wanted to move into that market now that the Civil Rights Act had passed, except for Washington, for that very reason. You're absolutely right.
That's very interesting. Well, before we get into sort of the setup there that you just got us into, I actually want to go back to a comment that you just said earlier, which is sort of this history and sports kind of not sort of being a conjoined pursuit, shall we say, or sports history, if you will, not being taken as seriously, say, in the academic pursuits of history, they say, than other topics. It's interesting as frankly, a de facto or by no choice amateur historian, right? I've come into contact with lots of other, shall we say, amateur historians, and whether that's officialized in things like saber and baseball and those kinds of things, or just unofficial, somebody writing a book about a particular team that they maybe grew up with and were fond of and wondered what happened to the players or the league that was in and that kind of stuff. Arguably this podcast, right? I grew up as a Cosmos soccer fan back in the 70s, and then, but 5 years later, the league was gone and soccer was dead for 15 years or so. So there's obviously other issues floating around, but why do you think this sort of sports thing, aside from sort of the occasional, baseball documentary series by Ken Burns, for example, which is arguably taken much more seriously and more methodically, why do you think sports and history don't sort of, why is sports not at a quote unquote higher level than, say, the 15th book on Andrew Jackson's life?
It's a great question. And the answer is probably more complicated, but I usually chalk it up to the fact the kind of people who go into academia are the kind of people who were never really part of the sports world growing up. And so they were probably the people who were either bullied by athletes or something else. And so they've grown up to kind of resent it. I always try to tell them, though, that you're right about the Andrew Jackson comment, that, we exalt, for example, religious history, but any given Saturday in the South. Any weekend in the fall in the South, there are way more people who attend a football game than attend church. And not only that, but they go and they paint up and they do all kinds of things and go into all kinds of ecstatics that no one in church in the South would ever do. And to argue that somehow religious history is more important than sports history is to miss the point of the United States. It totally gets wrong what cultural history is and what we're supposed to be figuring out about what things mean to people. I remember back in 2008, whenever President Obama was not yet president. He was still the candidate, and the Democratic National Convention held their final day of their convention in Mile High Stadium, outdoors. And it was a big deal. And the commentary was all, this is amazing. They filled the football stadium for this event. And I just kept thinking to myself, yeah, the Broncos do that 8 times a year, and nobody ever talks about it. And so the idea that politics and religion and other forms of history are somehow more important is really a creature of the kinds of people we take into our business, and not the kinds of people, not the kinds of actual studies that matter to cultural history. All academia is gatekeeping, and the people who get to keep the gates tend to be the kinds of people who resent sports. But I think, for all of your listeners, it's good for them to know that they are all wrong, and that you cannot understand the United States and its history without understanding its relationship with sports, because that has been not only important in religious studies or political studies, but also in race studies and foreign policy. Sports has been the gateway to every important thing that's ever happened in this country. And it's a process, but we're trying to inculcate that more effectively in the academy.
Yeah, I guess in a lot of cases, sports can be sort of looked upon as a shorthand or perhaps even a metaphor or some other transformative device, frankly, for some of the larger societal issues, better or
exactly. It becomes the theater for everything. And you'd be surprised how many people, and you mentioned Sabre, I work with Sabre quite a bit, and how many of those people are math people, not history people. They do history, but they're coming from math departments because history departments are less kind of willing to go there. It's crazy. It makes no sense. And a lot of the sports classes in universities are almost all run through kinesiology departments, almost never through history departments. It makes no sense. It's very frustrating.
Well, let's try to make some sense of your argument and your sort of how you frame this one, right? So, I mean, this is not sort of the first time we've kind of nibbled at the issue broadly and even more specifically by sport of race and sport, whether it be collegiate or professional or even more broadly than that. Give us a sense of sort of how you sort of approach this to sort of frame this. I mean, I think you gave us a few hints already by things like the Voting Rights Act and whatnot, but you're talking from, I guess, personal understanding, certainly, as well as culturally, a South, right, that has legendarily been, has had a long, torturous, and arguably still ongoing, challenging history with race. And in the case of basketball, which I think in a lot of people's minds is still sort of perceived as a predominantly, for whatever reasons, African-American oriented sport. The irony, of course, is that its origins were anything but that. If you look back at it, give us a sense of sort of how you kind of sort of framed all of this, and we'll kind of get into some of the gory details as we sort of move along here.
Sure. So the South, after World War II, was trying to get in on the rising Sunbelt market that kind of stretched from the bigger cities of North Carolina all the way through Phoenix and Denver and San Diego and places like that. They wanted to get in on that. They wanted to help be part of that new growth. They wanted to attract new businesses, and they wanted pro sports, but they couldn't get it because segregation laws were still in place until the mid to late 1960s. And so they would continue to try to do that and fail every time. Meanwhile, basketball develops, you're right, as a white game in the YMCA movement, starting in Massachusetts, invented by a Canadian, and then moves out from there. And we end up seeing early in basketball, even though Naismith hated it, a move to professionalization very quickly. And that professionalization did allow for at least some limited integration, I suppose, in the early 20th century, but that was relatively rare. And so we see a version of what we think of in baseball as the Negro Leagues. We get all black professional teams, usually playing in the bigger cities of the North, usually playing in dance halls after or before either before they open or after they close, to go along. You go, you get drunk, you party, you dance, and you watch this basketball game. And so they really develop on this separate trajectory. And football, for example, was always seen as a collegiate sport, and college was always seen as a relatively white endeavor in an age before financial aid and everything else. You had to be relatively wealthy to go. And so football was largely coded as a white game. Baseball, of course, famously had already drawn the color line back in the 1880s, and so that was considered a white game. Both of those games, though, also required equipment. They required balls and all kinds of other things to go along with it. You had to have money just to play, just to get the stuff to do it. All basketball required was a ball and a space. And so its main place where it catches on is in urban areas, not college towns and other places like that where there's more wealth. This is catching on in inner cities. It's largely being funded by YMCA gyms in relatively poor neighborhoods. And so early on, it becomes associated very quickly with ethnicity, whether it be Jewishness, Italianness, or blackness. Basketball was this urban kind of game. The other difference between basketball and those other sports is that you don't wear a hat or a helmet in basketball. And the players are right up next to the fans. Early on, as basketball started to professionalize, they would hold the games in these relatively small spaces like dance halls. And so what they would do, and it was very rough. There was no Jordan rules at this period, of course. I mean, everything was incredibly rough. And so they would put up cages around the court like they do in hockey today. And basketball was known as cage ball. I mean, we still hear sports writers refer to basketball as cagers, basketball players as cagers. That's why, because original basketball, pro basketball, was played in a cage. And so the fans are right up next to the out of bounds line. I mean, the ball could literally just bounce off the cage and you could catch it and keep going. And so the fans are right there. There's nothing to stop them. And so when you combine ethnicity and inner cityness with this close proximity to the people who are actually watching, race and ethnicity become attached to basketball in a way that they don't to other sports. And so basketball, by the time we get to the civil rights era, by the time that starts being a thing, at this point, but the NBA is going to be founded in 1950. But it had already been around a few years prior to that under another name, coming out of World War II. It is going to have a trickle of black players here and there, but it is going to be a largely white organization. The problem is that if all of the great players, all the people that are playing basketball in a way that people want to see, are coming out of inner city neighborhoods, and college sports, corrupt as it is going to want all of those best players, then they're going to go out and start getting the best players, which means they're going to start getting black players. And so we start to see the blackening of college basketball first, and that is going to move to the blackening of professional basketball. So much was the NBA worried about this blackening that they actually moved from 11 to 12 players in the early 1960s, specifically to make sure that teams could include a white guy at the end of their bench, so that white fans, who were the predominant payers for tickets, were still white people, would be able to see a white face on the bench, even if all the star players were black. It was an incredible worry for the NBA, and they started constantly looking for the great white hope to try to figure out a way to say, hey, look, white people are still good at basketball too. I mean, the era of Mikan had ended. The era of Jerry West was coming to an end. And they started to look for who is going to be, we're not yet to Bill Walton. So they're starting to look for who's going to be that next guy. At the same time, they look at the South, especially at 1964, when we get the Civil Rights Act, kind of the end of first wave civil rights. And they say, well, now we've got this whole new market of people who are clearly sports crazy. If you look at any college football stadium, you know these people are nuts for sports. They're growing these cities in big ways. We have a whole new market now. Maybe we can move into there. And so it creates this potential clash between a South that is trying to grow, but is still super racist and very much not over any of the eruptions that have happened recently. And an NBA that is trying to shed its black reputation to become more mainstream. And it creates all the things that we'll eventually talk about here in a few minutes.
Well, yeah, and the irony is already starting to kind of creep in, right? So let's now juxtapose that. Now, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act, obviously, a landmark achievement in legislative history, and you wonder if this country can ever achieve such progressive achievements going forward. But this is not a political podcast by any chance. But it's. I think everybody would agree that it's becoming more of a challenge. But you juxtapose that, so the broader dynamics of what's going on in this country, especially as it relates to race and all the various things we remember, from the television imagery back in the day. Some of it quite horrific, of course, and the tragedies of Martin Luther King and all that stuff. But juxtapose that against, say, where the history of professional basketball was at the time, the NBA, right? Not even, if you will, about 10 plus years old, still kind of finding its sea legs. But not only the NBA, but also professional sports finally starting to recognize that there are places outside the Midwest and the Northeast to domicile teams. And with television becoming such a central part of the entertainment experience in this country, right? Television exposure and money and national markets, plural, that are frankly untilled. And I think that the most logical progression of that, right, in the late 1950s with, the Dodgers and the Giants bolting west to California. But it's interesting when you look at some of these other sports. The NHL didn't really expand until 1967 after there were only 6 teams for, decades, right?
Decades. They had a minor league system that at least put teams in towns.
That's true.
Whereas some of the other sports like basketball, they really didn't have that opportunity.
Right. But when you look at some of the initial expansion that occurred in the NBA around that time in the 60s and early 70s, right? You notice a lack of a certain region of the country, right? I see San Diego, it ultimately moved to Houston, and I see Seattle and Phoenix and Milwaukee and Cleveland and Buffalo, which ultimately came to West Coast and the like. But it took until, frankly, the challenger league known as the American Basketball Association, and you may know we've had a couple of conversations with the now late, sadly, Dennis Murphy, the founder of that league. But it took a hugely entrepreneurial and arguably risky proposition for them to actually place one franchise in the Deep South that the NBA had avoided for many, many years. Maybe you can kind of sort of set the tone for that, because I don't think that was just because of nobility or good, just good-naturedness, right? It was the desire, I guess, probably to tap into some type of market that had been largely untapped by pro basketball.
Absolutely. I mean, and if you are creating a new league like the ABA, you want to go to places where you don't have to compete with an established league. You have this perfect confluence of places in the Sunbelt. All of these economies are booming after 1945 in major cities of the South. Also in the places you mentioned, out west, Denver, San Diego, places like that, Phoenix, which are these growing cities, urban markets, desperate to look like they matter, desperate to look like they have legitimacy, and the one place they feel like they can get into sports. And that is originally, you're right, going to create either expansion in the established leagues or team moves, like famously the Dodgers or the Giants or the St. Louis Browns or the Athletics or anybody else. All these teams are just going to try to take advantage of these new markets. And they're being drawn by tax havens, by new stadiums that places like New York simply can't build for them. And, you know, in most of the places in the South, I mean, they had lived ever since the days of slavery on this kind of don't tread on me kind of attitude that they use as an excuse for their racism, this notion that we believe in small government and we believe in not having institutional controls. And so therefore, you know that you're not going to get any state income tax. You know you're not going to have to worry about any of those things. And these places will bend over backwards for you. And the NBA was reluctant at first to go south simply because of the blackness of the league, but they had some experience of it already. One of the kind of great champion teams of the 50s was the St. Louis Hawks, owned by a guy named Ben Kerner. They had started off in New York. They had moved to Illinois moved to Milwaukee, then Illinois, and finally down to St. Louis. And St. Louis, while we don't think, like Washington, D.C., we don't think of it as a southern city per se, but it's as close as you can get to a southern city without being a southern city. Bill Russell constantly complained about having to play in St. Louis because of all the racial epithets he received in Kiel Auditorium where they played. And so there was some fear about the NBA going to that place. The NBA we look at today as a relative inevitability. But pro basketball had at least 8 different pro leagues before the NBA, all of which had failed. And so they knew that just because they had a relatively good run early on, that didn't guarantee anything. And they were worried about the possibility of racial incidents, kind of drawing a highlighter over their racial coding and making it more challenging for them to break into white audiences. The ABA has nothing to lose. And the great irony of that, of course, is that the ABA is going to be the league that openly celebrates its blackness. That is going to be the league that says we are black and we are proud. That is the league that is going to identify most with the budding black nationalist movement, that is going to let its players wear giant afros, that is going to do all these kinds of experiments to say, well, if the dominant nature of pro sports is to be predominantly white and to think like that, we're going to go the other way. The NBA had already been called to the carpet. Sport Magazine had already done this kind of blistering expose of the NBA in the early 1960s that said the NBA has a race problem. They are looking for a great white hope. They're adding players to the end of the bench simply so they could get white faces. White people aren't going to the games. The average attendance at NBA games in the early 1960s was 5,000 and much less in some of the smaller markets. That was only pulled up by Madison Square Garden. And because of that, it's going to give the NBA these qualms about doing that, whereas the ABA has nothing to lose. All they know is if we can create some kind of rival, and if we can create any kind of interest, we can force a merger. And the point from day one was to force a merger. And so why not go to places that the NBA isn't? If we go to try to compete with them in the same cities, there would be no incentive for a merger. The only incentive for merger is to make basketball look like baseball, to spread it out across the country. And so the ABA is going to initially put teams on the periphery of the South in Charlotte, North Carolina, and in Houston, Texas. And pretty soon, eventually, because of lobbying by the city, they are going to end up going straight into the Deep South in New Orleans.
But there's a bit of prelude, though, to that particular New Orleans situation, because I guess the Hawks themselves in the late 60s, I want to say it was like in an early 67 or so, were getting a little itchy to get a new arena. The Blues had just come in there in the NHL, and I think Kerner was looking to kind of maybe build his own facility to kind of keep his revenues going and whatnot. And there was a brief flirtation. I guess they were up for sale. And the eventual owners of the Buccaneers franchise in the ABA, including one Morton Downey Jr., odd
guy, yeah, absolutely,
asterisk of history, was actually one of the bidders, I think, and I guess the deal fell apart. And ironically, Atlanta could have been sort of that first, if you will, franchise that may have, or relocated franchise that might have broken the ice in the South. But ironically, it was those folks that brought it to New Orleans first. A pretty interesting I guess, pathway to kind of start to I don't know, melt that ice, if you will.
It really is. And frankly, there was a lot of talk in New Orleans about not wanting an ABA team. That if your goal is to be major league, if your ultimate goal, now that you have the Saints, and now that you've gone to the big leagues, what you really want is the NBA. And that was on everybody's mind. They wanted the NBA. They were building this massive new arena for the Saints, and they needed something else. But before that, they couldn't get the Hawks. So they end up settling, again, Morton Downey Jr., the same guy who later on will make his name as a racist right-wing talk show host, will go to the ABA, get a team, bring it to New Orleans, and the Buccaneers are born. Basketball comes to the deep, pro basketball comes to the Deep South. The problem is there wasn't a Superdome yet. There wasn't any real arena whatsoever. The team ended up playing in Loyola Fieldhouse, where Loyola University of New Orleans plays. They played in a couple of other arenas. It was not successful. And of course, that is not necessarily because of New Orleans. A lot of the ABA teams ended up not being successful and moved around quite a bit. The ABA will only stay there for a couple of years. It will ultimately move to Memphis, and then move again and then die, like so many of the other ABA franchises. The only place that the ABA really does well in the South was in Kentucky. Where the Kentucky Colonels were an almost nightly sellout. That's just because of the particular situation of Kentucky. What's interesting is that New Orleans is, of all the southern cities, the most racially cosmopolitan. And though it does have its long racialized history, the notion of black players in New Orleans is going to be not as big a deal as it's going to be elsewhere, because New Orleans has always been an integrated city. New Orleans was not only the home of initial train car segregation, but it was also the home of the black middle class that ended up suing and giving us Plessy versus Ferguson. So there has always been that population, and race didn't really turn out to be the big problem. Instead, it was inconsistent scheduling, no arena, no real national attention to the ABA until after its first couple of years. I mean, I think we can generally say that the ABA was saved by Dr. J, and he's still a kid at this point, and so he's still in high school, and so that's not going to happen for them, and it just doesn't work.
Well, let's move to the Hawks, though. Atlanta is also seen as I guess, as a, shall we say, budding cosmopolitan mecca of its own. Give me a sense of how similar or dissimilar Atlanta was in the, let's call it professional basketball broadly. Obviously, the ABA was not there, but certainly the Hawks did look at Atlanta anew again after having sort of flirted with selling the franchise in the first place. What is it about Atlanta? In many respects, it seems that, obviously today it's sort of the gateway, if you will, to the South. To me, in retrospect, you look at Atlanta as, you kind of hit Atlanta and you're successful there. The South is frankly your oyster after that point.
Right. Absolutely. And that's exactly what Atlanta wanted you to think. Atlanta has an interesting history. Before the Civil War, Atlanta was second to Macon in Georgia. And they had risen after the Civil War to become this budding metropolis. The big difference between Atlanta and New Orleans was, A, there was no integrationist tendency like there was in New Orleans and Atlanta. And B, Atlanta was way bigger and had a lot more money. And so Atlanta had, that's why they go out. That's why they get the Falcons, because they don't want to be left behind. The only two real major Deep South cities are New Orleans and Atlanta. They wanted to get those things, and they wanted all of the sports. And that included basketball. Atlanta has an incredibly large and incredibly influential Black population, far more segregated than it is in New Orleans, but it had always been there. Auburn Avenue and the Black middle class of Atlanta kind of made that city, and it had a long history of Black journalism that had covered the Harlem Wrens, the Harlem Renaissance Five, the major kind of Negro Leagues basketball team, and then later the Globetrotters. They cared about basketball. And there were a lot of white boosters in the town who were fans of the UGA basketball team, which was very popular. And they needed that too. They felt like that was it. Meanwhile, Ben Kerner back in St. Louis was desperate to sell. He did not want to be involved in basketball anymore. And if New Orleans fell through, he was going to keep looking. Atlanta very much wanted that team, and they went out and courted it. Have to remember that even though Kerner was trying to sell and he was losing money in St. Louis, and there weren't a lot of people coming to the games, St. Louis was really good. We always think about the Celtics and the Lakers as being the great East-West rivalry in the NBA. When the Lakers were still in Minneapolis, the team to beat in the West was the Hawks. And for years in the 1950s, almost every NBA Finals was the Celtics and the Hawks. And of course, the Celtics always win because they have Bill Russell, except for once when St. Louis Hawks do win the Hawks only championship. Actually, interestingly enough, I think fitting for our discussion here, the last all-white champion in the NBA was the St. Louis Hawks. The last time an all-white team won an NBA championship. That too is going to make it the kind of place that the kind of team that Atlanta is going to want. At the point where they are arguing for it, their star player is Bob Pettit, who was an SEC guy from LSU, a white player, a white star. This is what they wanted. And so they shell out way more money than the Hawks are worth to bring them to Atlanta. And again, they don't have an arena yet. So to convince the NBA, because the NBA requires you to have a professional arena that's only for them. You can also have hockey, of course, because the NBA was created by hockey owners. So, basketball originally, professionally, was started as a gimmick for hockey owners to make more money off their arenas. So hockey was okay, but everything else had to be specifically for pro basketball. So Atlanta promised to build this fancy arena, which they end up building, called the Omni, the original pro basketball place in Atlanta. But until then, the Atlanta Hawks come to Georgia. They don't have any place to play. They end up playing at Georgia Tech's Memorial Coliseum, which is just wood over a concrete slab. So, of course, it's going to create all kinds of injuries for the players. They hate it. Nobody comes to the games early on because they don't have their own arena. Most of the players are black. All of them report experiencing all kinds of virulent, ugly racism, not necessarily in their stadium, but living in Atlanta. And it is an experiment that doesn't start off well, I guess we could say.
All right, what's this? LinkedIn Jobs. Hey, these days it can be hard to find and hire the right candidates for your small business. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs made it easier to find the people that you want to talk to faster and for free. You can create a free job post in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 770 million people. Holy mackerel. I added that part. Focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience and use screening questions to get your role in front of only the most qualified. Then, use the simple tools on LinkedIn Jobs to quickly filter and prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Did you know that every week, nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/goodseats. That's linkedin.com/goodseats to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And now, back to our conversation. To describe some of that, and frankly also, too, I guess from the fan base, too, because I think some of it had to sort of creep into actually attending the games too, because in essence, you're attracting interest from, if you will, both sides of the racial spectrum, and I won't call it experiment, but it's certainly it seems like it would take a strong general management to take on this challenge, given the state of things in the late 60s, early 70s for both of these franchises.
It would, and yet they didn't have it. So they would go out before the Hawks actually got here. They would go out, the boosters in Atlanta would go out and try to sell pro basketball in the surrounding areas. They tried to make this Georgia's team, and they would go out to all these Kiwanis clubs and other kind of organizations to try to drum up interests in professional basketball coming to Atlanta, this great civic get for Georgia. And in every place they stopped, the first question was, do you have any white guys on the team? And they knew right away that race was going to end up being the #1 thing that they had to deal with. Though Bob Pettit was the big star, the actual best player of the St. Louis Hawks was a guy named Lenny Wilkens, who would later on become the great Lenny Wilkens, the coach and everything else. And Lenny Wilkens refused to go with the team to Atlanta because he knew what it was like in the South, and he wasn't going to go play in the South. Before the NBA actually came down to Atlanta, they would do their spring training in the South. They would run these kind of barnstorming circuits through southern cities, like the Globetrotters do today, to practice before they played their games. And there are horror stories, especially from Bill Russell and Elgin Baylor, two of the most vocal civil rights advocates in the league, and two of the guys who were very much willing to call people out when they were racist to them, about problems with restaurants, problems with sleeping accommodations. Every time they would go south, all the ugly names from people in the crowd, people waving the Confederate flag at the games. And there were a lot of black players who did not want to go. And so the whole ordeal starts off problematically because the actual best player on the Hawks refuses to go and forces a trade because he is not going to play in Atlanta. So that works out pretty badly. Another irony of that, of course, is that Lenny Wilkens' most important coaching stint was with the Hawks when he coached Dominique. And so they finally get there. The team is about half black, but for the starters, they're all black. And so it is a decidedly black team. Pogo Joe Caldwell was probably the most outspoken of those people. He gets there, and as soon as he gets there, when he gets off the bus and his wife is meeting them there, a red pickup truck drives up with a Confederate flag hanging out of it saying, "Welcome to Atlanta," N-word. And that was his first time to ever be in Atlanta. And it just kind of colored everything from there. The ownership and the management, not the coaches. The coaches very much are not thinking like this, but the management start to think, well, if the only thing people are interested in is the white players, and they are hostile to the blackness of the game of basketball, then what we need to do is to start recruiting white players to come play in Atlanta. Now, keep in mind, the Hawks had been in the NBA Finals the year before they moved to Atlanta. And this is a great team. And yet, their thinking is, it will be better for us financially to erode the quality of the team in favor of getting white players, especially white players from SEC teams, because that's what people want to see. That's what they see when they go to University of Georgia basketball games. And so over the course of the first couple of years of the Hawks' existence in Atlanta, management starts dismantling this team that had been in 6 NBA finals over the last decade, getting rid of all of its good black players and replacing them with these mid-card SEC white guys so that people will come to the games. And because white fans don't care if they win, they want to make sure they're white. And sadly, that actually boosts attendance. As the record goes down, attendance goes up because more and more white people are playing. And of course, the apotheosis of all of this will be a couple of years, 3 years after the Hawks arrive in Atlanta, when they draft the ultimate great white hope, Pete Maravich.
All right. Well, so let's put Pistol Pete sort of in context now, because you've mentioned sort of the great white hope sort of generally, and now I think even more to a player more specifically. I guess I'm really interested in hearing why somebody of this caliber, obviously Hall of Famer, and it just still mesmerizing to this day. You look at all the clips on YouTube and stuff. I mean, it's just amazing, one of a kind talent. Why was it so important to have this, again, at the time, I guess, budding but obvious, yet white superstar into this mixture? Why was that such an important element to for this franchise? Because I would imagine that at this time, and I'm not a cultural historian by any means, but I have to think that Atlanta around this time, I mean, there was a growing and very influential black middle class at this point that would certainly be adding to the value of this franchise in terms of their interest in the sport and supporting it, in addition to whatever non-white elements were out there.
You're absolutely right. There is a thriving black middle class in Atlanta. The problem is that they were not being advertised to in the same way that white audiences were, because if you start getting a large black fan base coming to the games, it doesn't matter what the players look like. White folks aren't going to come. So
it's almost like there's a continuation of that sort of segregationalist kind of approach from a marketing perspective. It's almost like this is a team, although the league is predominantly African-American in its play, this team is going to be still marketed as not that.
Absolutely. It's got to be. I mean, hell, this hasn't ended. I mean, just a few years ago, you're probably familiar, Danny Ferry got fired as our general manager in Atlanta I say our. I'm in Georgia. I'm a Hawks fan.
So you just gave yourself away. Okay.
Sorry. Danny Barry got fired 3 years ago because he was complaining that there were too many black fans at the games, and we're not going to draw white fans if we keep catering to black audiences and having rappers on the sideline and everything else. He ends up getting fired, but that was the dominant attitude in the front office in Atlanta. Is that now that Atlanta is a majority black city, black folks are coming to the Atlanta Hawks games, and so white people aren't coming anymore. White people spend more money. We need to figure out a way to get more white people to our games. And that's in, 2016? This is not like something that has ever really gone away. But yes, it was you didn't have to hide it as much in the early days as you do now. But certainly that was part of it. And so every once in a while you do see advertisements in the major black newspaper in Atlanta, the Atlanta Daily World, for Hawks games. But they were relatively rare, whereas you saw them every day in the Atlanta Constitution, the main white paper in the city. So they were clearly playing to a very certain kind of crowd. And that crowd is the same crowd that spent their Saturdays in the fall at SEC football games, that followed the SEC, that cared about the SEC more than anything else in the way that we still do today. The SEC is still the most important entity in the South. It has been since the Confederacy fell. The SEC is everything down here. And so what we want is white SEC players because A, they're white, but B, the only kind of basketball that people have really had contact with in the South is college basketball. And so the best thing for us to do is to get recognizable faces for them. That they're white helps us, but what we really want is recognizability. We want SEC people. LSU, Pete Maravich is an interesting story because while he was the most amazing college basketball player ever, by any account, we don't have very much footage of him at all from college, almost none. Because while he was amazing, LSU sucked. They were never good. They were never featured. They were never on television because he was the best guy on a relatively bad team. And so that hurts him and helps him. It hurts him because the scouts don't have the same kind of tape on him that they have on everybody else. It helps him in that it grows this myth because all you hear about Pete Maravich is the stories that people tell about him and what he does, and nobody's ever seen anything like it before. And so he's got this popular kind of appeal to everybody. This amazing white basketball player in the South from the SEC. Meanwhile, scouts and the people who actually make it their business to know which players to draft are actually not incredibly high on Pete Maravich because they just don't know enough. Meanwhile, there are all these other great players from more established programs that they do know a lot more about. And so it would be better, they argue, if we draft those guys instead of this unknown quantity, because to them it seems like the only reason that people care about Pete Maravich is because he's a white guy from the South. And he has floppy hair and he looks very mod in the sense of in the style of the times. So there really is a disconnect between Maravich's popularity coming out of college and his draft stock among those who make it their business to know.
Yeah, and so it's just interesting though that so when he he graduated from LSU and was drafted by the Hawks,
right?
Where again, were the Hawks assuming that he was going to sort of ascend into superstardom, or because it took him a little while to sort of get adjusted? I mean, he really didn't start to hit all cylinders until a couple of years into his tenure there. And like you said, I mean, the Hawks, had a flash of greatness, but they were certainly not a playoff caliber at that time, even with him.
Right. So they had been the champions in St. Louis. They had eroded that team specifically to put white SEC guys on there. The owner of the Hawks was a guy named Tom Cousins, a Georgia politician who owned the team, was a big booster for Atlanta. He had seen Maravich play when they came to UGA. And it was from that moment when he said, I'm getting him on my team. And he forced management to take Maravich at 3. They had the 3rd pick. The brass did not want him. So they just kind of were forced to take him. But because we are in the era of the ABA, there is this assumption that he doesn't have to come here. And, he's also very much drafted in the ABA. He can go there, and maybe his style of play is more ABA. I mean, he's kind of Dr. J before Dr. J. And so maybe he would go there. And so to lure him there, the Hawks not only draft him third, I should say that he was drafted 3rd overall behind 2 other Hall of Famers. Bob Lanier goes first in that draft, and then Rudy Tomjanovich goes next. So he's behind legitimately great players at 3. So they end up giving him everything. They give him $1 million contract. They give him his own driver. They give him cars. They give him a secretary. They give him all of these concessions that nobody else would give him. Not only that, but they at least flirted with giving his father, Press Maravich, who was the coach at LSU, the head coaching job, just to make sure he'd come there. Now, they end up not doing that. I think Pete wanted to get away from his dad. He'd been his coached by his dad his whole life. So they ended up not doing that. But they were very willing to do that as well. And so they mortgage the entire team's future. They sell everything to get him, which is going to do 2 things. One, it's going to ensure that no matter what he does, he's not going to have good players around him no matter what. So this is going to be another LSU situation where they can't afford good players because they've spent everything on him. Second, it's going to alienate him from all the other players on the team who are more established, who have proven themselves, who there is actually tape on, and who get just nothing compared to what he gets. I mean, he makes 4 times what the next guy on his team gets. I mean, it's insane. And when you add the fact that those good players are black and that he is an unproven white guy who is really only being drafted because of his status as a white star from the SEC, it is going to create real problems for Pete early on. His teammates aren't going to like him very much because he's going to seem aloof and he's going to seem whatever else because he's got all the money and because he's getting all the things that they believe they should get. And it's also going to put unfair expectations on him because when you've been playing on a losing team for the last 3 years at LSU with no TV cameras and anything else, you can be great. And if you mess up, nobody's going to really know. They're only going to talk about the good stuff. Now you're in the NBA when everybody is paying attention. And they've put this kind of expectation on him that even if he was great right out of the gate, there's no way he ever could have matched those expectations. This is in an age when we're not giving people 7-figure deals, and he gets one as this unproven nobody that wasn't even on the top 5 of anybody's draft board except for Atlanta. And when you combine that with what everybody has seen them doing for the last 3 years of trading away black players, getting white SEC guys, it's only, so as another example, in the 8th round, they draft another white guy from LSU, Pete Maravich's roommate at LSU, who he travels with on the road, who is not good enough for the bench of the ABA. I mean, he's just a bench player at LSU. They draft him in the 8th round, give him a contract, get him on the team, and let him be Maravich's roommate on the road so he doesn't have to room with any of the other players. I mean, that's the level of sellout they go for Maravich. And it wasn't fair to the Hawks fans, first of all, because it's going to ensure their team sucks for a long time. But it's really not fair. And it's not fair to the other players, certainly. I mean, the racial tensions that develop because of that Maravich contract are real. And to be fair, legitimate, Pogo Joe Caldwell argued in his book, though it's not verified by any other source, he argued in his book that he complained to the ownership about Maravich's contract, and he demanded a $5,000 raise. I mean, minuscule amount of money in the scheme of things. And that the ownership said, we're not giving an N-word anything. Everything goes to Pete. And the racial tensions on the team are real. It's not fair to them. It's not fair to the fans. And especially it's not fair to Pete because it created, I think, I think it was the beginning of a lot of the problems that he's going to have later in his life.
It's interesting, right? Because I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's interesting in that it just seems like it's so much to give up to, if you will, mortgage the franchise or tilt the franchise so much towards this, as you said it before, great white hope. I mean, there's no doubt. It seems like the crowds were still intrigued with what was on the court because he was a draw for sure. I mean, just him alone. I mean, sadly, you can't just have one guy against five, right? But it just seems like a large price to pay when, I mean, maybe aside from one season or two when he was with the Hawks, they actually qualified for the playoffs. You know, and they followed him to the Jazz. We'll get to that in a second. This is, for all his greatness, and don't get me wrong, this was one of the greatest players easily in the top 50 or top 75, whatever the list this year is in the NBA of all time. I wouldn't call him necessarily the greatest cog in team building and team mechanics of winning franchises.
Right. Absolutely. He wasn't. And part of that was his fault, but most of it wasn't. I mean, he was really set up for failure. I mean, so Bob Lanier goes first in that draft. We're not yet on the pay scale like we are now in the NBA, where you just get paid where you're slotted and everybody has a contract. I mean, Pete Maravich gets paid 3 times. He gets 3 times the contract of what Lanier gets at 1, and he's the 3rd pick. So, I mean, it is, and I think it's important to note that, of course, Bob Lanier not only is a great player and also one of those top 50 players, but he's black. So, I mean, there's going to be just resentment everywhere. There's no way you can lead a team if they all resent you. And with the racial situation that had existed in the NBA and that was currently existing in the Atlanta franchise and in the Atlanta city, there was just no way Pete was going to be able to succeed there in any kind of sustained way. Now, he was very much able to showcase his brilliance. I mean, that is absolutely true. He is able to do things that nobody else can do. And when that shows itself, it is amazing and it is great and people love to see it. But there's only so much you can ask of a fan base when they're coming to see a losing team every night. And there's only so much you can ask of Pete when you're coddling him in this way and giving him this kind of treatment and really separating him from his teammates to the point where they can't even really be teammates. And whenever anything goes wrong with the Hawks, nobody is going to blame the coach. Nobody is going to blame the owners. Everybody is going to blame Pete, because he gets more money than anybody else, and it just becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that ends up leading to his doom and kind of drives the Hawks down this road of futility, which really won't get fixed until they get another SEC star a decade later in Dominique. So, it is a problem for Pete. It is a problem for the Hawks. It is a problem for what it says about racial assumptions in pro basketball in the early 1970s.
All right. Well, let's talk about sort of his next move and the broader implications of the city we mentioned earlier, New Orleans, now getting finally ready to get a franchise of its own, and this time an expansion franchise in 1974. And maybe this feels to me like it's almost sort of yet another chapter, sort of in this Great White Hope thing. In this case, I think the word that you haven't mentioned or used, maybe you did use it and I just missed it, and I'll just project it onto here and you tell me why it's right or wrong, is identity. And it feels to me it's almost like, at least the Hawks franchise at the time, it's almost like they were trying to, if you will, allow the fans to identify more easily to the product on the court via this great 100%. White superstar. Okay, so it seems to me like that sort of ill-logicked, if that's the right word, ill-fated logic, erroneous logic, whatever, what I'm trying to say, is being repeated again with the foundation of this Jazz franchise. Maybe the only thing, though, I could maybe see justified is the fact that he's essentially a home product, i.e. LSU, although he's been all over the place, right? Born in Pennsylvania, et cetera. But it's almost like the ultimate in identity. It's here's a local hero, if you will, but is also this white local hero that you can identify with, fans. And what better way to kickstart a new franchise than by bringing this guy into it and being the star attraction?
Absolutely. If Southern teams are looking for white guys from the SEC, you can't do any better than a home guy like that. And the Jazz, so first of all, the Jazz were owned by a minority group that was outside of the state. They were owned by a group from California. And so they were trying to figure out how best to inculcate themselves into the region. Meanwhile, the city had learned from the Buccaneers that you've got to create some kind of draw for people to make them want to come. And LSU was always the draw in Louisiana. Baton Rouge is about an hour down the road. And just like Athens is about an hour down the road from Atlanta. And so the idea was Pete would fit perfectly here. Now, remember that the Buccaneers didn't have the same kind of racial troubles that Atlanta did, that the Hawks did, but the Jazz are going to kind of build on a Hawks model rather than on a Buccaneers model. They get this team and they take all the mistakes that the Hawks make and kind of kick them up to 11. So they have a new arena coming soon. They too have to play their first year in a variety of local gyms, but eventually they are going to move into the Superdome. And the reason why people were arguing to get a pro basketball team was specifically because the Superdome needed more dates. The Superdome ended up becoming the most expensive project in the history of the state, millions of dollars over budget. Nobody knew how they were going to be able to afford it. It was argued that with only 8 dates for a pro football season, that if the Superdome didn't get at least 200 more per year, that the Superdome would collapse after 1 year only. I mean, that was how bad Louisiana was in debt on the Superdome. And so we need at least pro basketball to put in the dome. So they get a team to put in the dome, and their desperation. And because it was desperation built around an arena, they start, before they even get Pete Maravich, destroying their future because of their deal with the Superdome. I mean, just to get into the Superdome, the Jazz promised the Dome Commission, the commission that ran the Superdome, they promised them to pay them $2,000 a game just for the right to be there, or 8% of gross ticket sales, whichever was more. And after that, it would be 10% of gross ticket sales. They agreed that they would get no income, that all the income from concessions, from parking, from stadium advertising, from all that kind of stuff would go to the Superdome, not to the Jazz. I mean, there was no way that they were going to make money playing basketball in New Orleans with that kind of deal. They also agreed to be the ones to hire all the ticket takers and the security and the ushers and the janitors. That was all on the Jazz expense books too. So even before they get any players, the franchise is doomed. It is done before they even start because they give this crazy Pete Maravich deal to the Superdome. Then to try to get people in the seats, because the only way they're making money is off tickets now because of all of this other stuff, they've got to go out and get somebody who will sell them. And so they end up mortgaging everything else to get Maravich. And so whereas they pay a Hawks and Maravich kind of money deal to the Superdome to try to get a place to play, they give Atlanta all of their basketball capital. I mean, they give up like 2 first-rounders, 2 second-rounders, 3 third-rounders, options to make those second-rounders first-rounders if they end up doing worse. I mean, they completely mortgage their future to get Pete Maravich, to the point where, again, just like in Atlanta, there was no way that Pete Maravich was going to have any good players around him because they had given away all their draft picks. They had given away everything to Atlanta. And while all they're essentially doing is picking up Pete's contract, and they're not having to do more with that, as we've already seen, his contract was so insane that they're also going to have to pay all that money, along with giving up every single possibility they could ever have for success in the Dome. And sure enough, just like in Atlanta, having Pete was interesting for a time. People liked seeing him, but nobody's going to keep going if all you do is lose. And all the Jazz did was lose.
But man, did they lose in style, right?
It was fun.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I remember, a lot of those sort of, not so much the Atlanta years, but certainly the New Orleans years, the very rare times that I, living in the Northeast, might see a regional NBA game featuring Maravich, or maybe it was a local game like the Knicks going down or the Nets going down to New Orleans. Well, it's more the Knicks, right? Because it was the Nets were still in the ABA at the time. But it's quite a revelation. I mean, you didn't sort of forget. It was always really a matter of not like how the Jazz would play, but how many points would Pete score. And I, if you're starting a franchise, I guess you need every gimmick to get going, right? But the reality is that I hate to call him a sideshow, but I think that's the main attraction. And if that's, if he's having an off night or his knees are not performing as they clearly started not to on a more regular basis as the years went on, that makes for a difficult competitive situation for a team playing against, night after night against, some of the slogan that's part of the NBA travel experience.
Exactly. I mean, and it really was a problem. And what's interesting is that arenas around the country where the Jazz played, attendance went up several thousand on the nights the Jazz were there, not just because they assumed that their team would win, but because this was their chance to see Pete play live. And everybody wanted to see that. The Jazz, even though they were a bottom feeder team, were featured on national television more than any other team except for the Knicks, the Celtics, and the Lakers, because they had Pete. And even though executives at the television networks knew they were going to lose, because people wanted to see Pete. And so he is doing what he's brought there to do, I suppose. The problem is that New Orleans itself and the Jazz franchise don't reap any of those benefits, either in revenue, which they lose every single year they're in New Orleans, or in victories and actual team success. And the whole point of getting these professional franchises to come to the South was to prove that, hey, we're not backwards anymore. I mean, we're part of the Sunbelt. We're this new thriving cities. It wasn't just getting those teams. That was step one, but you also want to have winning teams. I mean, you want to be able to compete. You want something to brag about. Having a team that is a bottom feeder team doesn't really do the kind of work that you're hoping those teams will do. And so in every other way, the Pete experiment fails in both of those cities. And what's interesting is that for Pete, it was the normal thing. He was essentially the sideshow at LSU, the best player on a bad team. The same thing happened in Atlanta, and then the same thing happened in New Orleans. And then before the New Orleans moves, he ends up retiring. So that was all he ever knew. One of the greatest players who ever played, but never really got a chance to play in a good team. Partly that was his fault. Certainly, but also it was because he played for two teams that were experiments in the South in a period of racial turmoil that were simply not ready for the rigors of what a pro basketball team was supposed to be.
And why? So I guess the loaded question then is why the Jazz lasted so shortly, such a short period of time before going to the oddly greener pastures nobody would have predicted back in when they moved in 77, 78 to Salt Lake City. So maybe putting it in large perspective or in small perspective. I mean, was it Pete Maravich? Was it the franchise essentially giving away the store to get him? Was it the New Orleans Superdome or the Louisiana Superdome and its inability to be packed at any great shape or form? Was it the dimensions of the fan base? Why do you think the Jazz lasted for such a short period of time before getting out of Dodge?
So there are a few reasons for that. The first, you're right, the Superdome is a terrible place to play basketball. It's still a terrible place. Even when they bring the NCAA tournament there, it's a terrible place to play basketball. But even more so because even though the Jazz never were at the bottom of the attendance list, they averaged about 5,000 people a game. The problem is when you're in a cavernous stadium, 5,000 people does not look like very many people. And so it looked worse than it really was. They never had a profit in New Orleans. Both of those things were big problems. They never won. That was a big problem. Meanwhile, the owner of the team, the guy who ended up founding it to begin with, the guy named Sam Battistone from California, was a devout Mormon. And Salt Lake City had one of the last great successful ABA teams, the Utah Stars, who, even when they weren't winning, always drew crowds. They did incredibly well. And as a matter of fact, the Utah Stars actually play a role in the whole Pete saga at the beginning, too, because their star player when Pete moves from Atlanta was a guy named Jimmy Jones who had gone to college in Louisiana, who was a New Orleans native, and who was actively lobbying to come play point guard for the Jazz. He was an all-star in the ABA. He was great, but he wasn't a great white hope. He was, a black guy from the wrong side of the tracks in New Orleans who had ended up doing well, but he had gone to an HBCU. He didn't have the kind of name recognition or the recognition that white fans would know. And so they pass on him. They get Pete instead and mortgage their entire future for him. It doesn't work. By the time a few years pass, Jones has retired. The ABA has merged and Utah did not become part of it. So Salt Lake feels like, even though we're a small market, New Orleans is the smallest city in the NBA. It's still the smallest city in the NBA. It's still the smallest city in the NFL, save maybe Green Bay if we don't count Milwaukee. And so it's a small place. I mean, there's only a few 100,000 people in New Orleans. So if they can do it, we can do it. We've already proven that we've had success in the ABA with the Stars. They even the years they didn't win, they won the attendance thing every single year that the Utah Stars were there. And of course, you have a Mormon owner who says, well, I'm not making any money. I'm moving money hand over fist. I know for a fact that Salt Lake City wants a team and will cater to me. And that's where the Mormons are. And so he decides to move them.
Yeah, and keeping the Jazz name, which is the ultimate curiosity in our exploration. It's to this day, it defies logic that the Jazz name not only was kept, but is stuck for all these decades since.
It's crazy. And, the Jazz, the name itself, they didn't have a name for the NBA franchise in New Orleans. They decided on Jazz from a fan vote. They did a thing through the New Orleans Times-Picayune where they would just have people write in names, and Jazz won a contest. That's how they ended up picking that name. It wasn't even any kind of strategic marketing thing. It was just a contest name that won. Why Badisson decided to keep the Jazz name has baffled all of us all of these years. I mean, it makes no sense, but
that's right up there with the Lakers of Los Angeles.
That's right. Exactly.
How many lakes that I'm familiar with in LA, in the basin in particular.
Exactly. That's true. But again, of course, we could also say that no one in Manhattan wears Knickerbockers anymore, but we still call the Knicks the Knicks. So
Dodgers, it goes on. But the Jazz probably the most egregious.
But Jazz is probably the weirdest one of them all, to be sure. I mean, it is crazy.
And these kids today, they don't know from Jazz. They don't understand the history of it, right? But this is, to me, it's fascinating, and it's amazing what people will accept without questioning it. Sure. Utah Jazz. And by the way, I'm sure there are quite a few great jazz places in Salt Lake and environs. So please, no emails telling me how great.
Right, probably. So you're never going to hear me say anything bad about Salt Lake City. That's where they film Fletch. I mean, come on. I mean, I will always be a fan of Salt Lake, even though I've never actually been there. But I will say that the move to Salt Lake just devastated Pete. I mean, it's bad enough kind of being the Great White Hope in Atlanta, being that in the place where you're from, or at least where you're associated with most, was just destroyed him, that he couldn't succeed there. Partly because he didn't have a team around him, partly because in the few years he was there, each year became worse and worse for his knees and for various leg issues that he had. And when the team decided to move, I mean, I think part of Badisson's idea was that Pete would sell well in Salt Lake. I mean, again, another city that is dominated by white people, and where they want to have kind of a white face. And he thought Pete could be that there, but Pete retires rather than go to Salt Lake, just completely defeated, as somebody who just failed his city, even though he didn't. That was certainly his thinking. By that point, he had already kind of, I don't want to say he was into full-on alcoholism, but he was certainly on the road to that. At that point, the pressure of being the guy in these two places where he never succeeded, and it ended up just killing whatever career he might have had left. That move to Utah.
Okay, so let's round the corner here then. So give me a sense then of what you think, sort of the legacy of professional basketball in the South was, given that sort of tortuous and curious set of histories amongst those franchises, in particular those two markets, because it was still quite a bit of time after that period of time, after the Jazz moved to Salt Lake City, that the NBA more fully embraced other southern cities beyond Atlanta. I mean, Ted Turner obviously coming into the mix in Atlanta and giving more resources and marketing muscle, shall we say, to that team amongst his other holdings. But then the introduction of Charlotte, the discovery, if you will, of Florida for two franchises and that kind of stuff. And the rebirth, if you will, of New Orleans, even though they can't seem to keep a name. I guess it's Pelicans now. Well, and even Charlotte, frankly, had its hiccups as a franchise, right? I don't know if that's necessarily thematic to your argument here, but give me a sense. I mean, it still took. It was not a fait accompli. Still, that beyond Atlanta, with a major owner with major national marketing muscle and a media mogul at that, that the South and basketball, the NBA, was still going to be a marriage made in heaven. Arguably, what it is more so today.
Right. And, I think the two things that really alert the NBA to the possibility that the South could still be a viable market was A, that the Hawks didn't leave. And they ended up being financially stable, even though they weren't always very good. But the most important thing that happened that ended up opening up the South to the NBA was Dominique Wilkins. When he comes out of UGA, goes to the Hawks, all of a sudden, Southern basketball becomes an obsession for a lot of people. By the 1980s, while racial inequality was and still is a real problem in the South, there was more black capital that existed there. There was more interest in the NBA. There was more interest. By that point, we already had the Showtime Lakers. We had already, by 1984, when Dominique comes into the league, we had already moved the NBA Finals off tape delay and made them live. Dominique Wilkins was a real star. All of a sudden, not only were the Hawks good, but they were selling out the arena. And it gave David Stern, who had always been the chief legal counsel for the NBA during those first efforts, who was now the commissioner of the NBA, it gave him the incentive to start thinking like, for example, Pete Davidson, like somebody who would kind of see new markets as real possibilities. And so he turned back to the Sunbelt for expansion, realizing that the South really could be successful in the right situation. Now that at least the worst part of the racial struggles had kind of given way. And it's interesting. I mean, even before we get Charlotte and then we get Orlando and the Heat, even before that, the Timberwolves in Minnesota in the late 1980s were right about 5 years after Dominique comes into the league, were having real financial difficulties in Minneapolis. And we're also thinking about leaving. And it was almost a completely done deal that they were coming to New Orleans, that they were going to, and they ended up having so much so that they even ran the similar naming contest in New Orleans to replace the Jazz, like they did. And so they had a naming contest because everybody in Louisiana was very sure they were going to get the Timberwolves. Because it was time that we had Dominique. Southern basketball was good. Everybody cared. Every time the Celtics and the Hawks played was a huge deal again because of Bird versus Dominique, just like it had been in the 50s. And so all of a sudden it was okay again. The Timberwolves are ready to come down. They have a naming contest. Interestingly enough, way better name that time. The winning name for the Timberwolves was Sinners, so that New Orleans would have the Saints and the Sinners as their two professional teams. And that's the next team that would have been the next Southern NBA team. It turns out not to happen. The Sinners never exist because new financing steps in Minneapolis to try to convince the team not to leave. And so they end up not coming. But that willingness of the team to go, New Orleans' promise of a non-football arena for them, and the seeming acceptance of everybody in New Orleans. They had tens of thousands of people vote on new names for the team. It showed David Stern that with the combination of the success of Atlanta with Dominique and the seeming interest in New Orleans, that there really was an opportunity in the South now that we were a generation off of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And he didn't decide to come back to New Orleans. There was still kind of a rough legacy there. And New Orleans really is a super small place, even though we don't think of it as such. It really is too small to hold a lot of professional sports. Instead, he decides to go where basketball has always been popular. He thought about Kentucky, thinking about the Colonels and their successful run in the ABA, ended up winning the bid with Charlotte, again, from the other kind of major basketball Southern place. And that opens the floodgates and hasn't really looked back.
Yeah, and look, I think you can also, circling around your broader theme. I mean, you can. I was just sort of marveling at this a couple of days ago, watching some NBA telecasts over Christmas Day. it feels to me like the NBA is by far the most progressive, inclusive, understanding of the Black experience, aligning with the realities of the majority of their playing base, willing to embrace cultural differences. I mean, it just seems like the relationship between the league and its players, with those broader issues in mind, it just seems like has come such a long way from the times that we're talking about, to the point where, it's hard. Still, many things left to go. But arguably, I think it's become almost a hallmark of how professional leagues can and should embrace their players and what they stand for, and the messages that they want to bring and represent, frankly, in order for for all attending and all watching to kind of better harmonize with the game that's being played. It seems almost anachronistic to what we just described over those decades in the 60s and 70s.
You're right. The NBA has felt its kind of racial legacy more than any of the other leagues, and does a better job of responding to its players. They stand up on a variety of issues, and the NBA, and especially the WNBA, are the two most progressive of all of the professional sports leagues. At the same time, however, remember that we are in the process right now of cleaning out the Phoenix Suns organization because of all of their racial problems.
Very true.
We are only a few years out of Donald Sterling.
Yeah.
We are only a few years out of Danny Ferry and my beloved Hawks cleaning house because all of their people are racist too. So while the NBA players are doing very well, and Adam Silver has been great about facilitating those things, we have to remember that most of that action comes from the NBA's willingness to accommodate players, not from a top-down kind of thing. Remember, it was LeBron arguing that we're not going to play in the bubble unless you let us do Black Lives Matter. It was the players who were kind of channeling Bill Russell, who are saying, listen, we want to be spokespeople. You can't fine me for the I Can't Breathe shirt. And now, to the NBA's credit, they listen to those things and they have acted on them. But the upper administration of the NBA, with the exception of Michael Jordan in Charlotte, is overwhelmingly white and still has a lot of racial issues. The one benefit it has is and with the WNBA, is that its league leaders listen to the players. And so when we think about the progressiveness of the NBA, we are thinking less about league initiatives and more about the league responding to player initiatives that are kind of rechanneling and reconnecting with the civil rights era players. Because remember, I mean, in between Bill Russell and his generation that actually played and then left the arena and went out and fought for civil rights, in between that and now, we had Jordan, the greatest player ever, but one who refused to engage in politics and refused to get involved in any rights issues and refused to comment on Rodney King and refused to do all of those things, specifically because he wanted to make money for Nike and everything else. And so we've gone kind of in waves. And in each of those waves, the progressive nature of the NBA and now the WNBA has not been sparked by the league itself and by the owners or the governors, because the owners and governors are, frankly, old white guys. Instead,
capitalists at that.
Yeah, absolutely. What we end up seeing is that the owners now being willing to give in to player demands when it comes to social justice issues. And it makes the NBA the leader in all of that. But it is because of the players, and maybe Adam Silver, but not because of the owners. Unfortunately, we still have tons of troubles with racial issues in the part of management groups and various NBA teams.
Yeah, point well taken. And I guess it almost, in some respects, I hate to sort of throw the word in there, but it almost feels like appeasement in some respect.
No, I think that's fair.
But then I also then think about, too, it's also leverage, right? And the players, it seems maybe the better way to sort of characterize it is that perhaps more so than any other league, it would seem, although we'll see how the baseball offseason, if you will, plays out, and we have a season. The leverage is clearly with the players, and I wonder, how much the owners kind of maybe, how they might not necessarily recognize that it's not just about appeasing, but it's about equity and to your point, in the senior management levels and all those things, all those other wrongs that still need to be righted. I guess the one last question I'll ask you then, just to close this thread, do you wonder about, and this is something for pro sports generally, not just the NBA, but included in, is this, it's always been big money. It's getting bigger money. And that money now is coming from things like private equity and partial ownership and maybe multiple minor stake ownership from private equity entities, perhaps in collusion with other sports. The corporatization, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. Do you worry that the structural finances, if you will, behind pro sports generally, maybe the NBA specifically, real estate and building experiences and NFTs and all these other revenue streams and stuff, do you think that's going to have a material change effect either positively or negatively with this, let's call it progress, but still progress yet to go on these issues? Or, I mean, I tend to be a glass half empty on those kinds of things, because valuations, I just wonder if it all comes collapsing down or gets I don't know, this mutual admiration society may not necessarily cross that bridge into pure economics.
Well, that's always been the critique, right? I mean, people have argued that the NBA is very willing to give in to demands of, I want to put something on the back of my jersey, but when it comes to eliminating the salary cap, they hold firm and are willing to lock out the players in the NBA for something like that. I mean, so yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there is a very cynical way to look at this, to say, well, a lot of these kind of more progressive issues that these leagues are willing to take up are largely cosmetic. And I think that's true. And yes, I think it would be better if the NBA, if the players had more leverage in salary cap negotiations and getting rid of the rookie wage scale and things like that. But the cosmetic things that they are willing to do still matter. And that is the public face of what everybody sees. And if we think of social justice as largely a PR campaign, then they're doing exactly what they should do. When it comes to private equity and other things like that kind of dominating the sports landscape, I think what it's going to end up doing is creating a situation that looks very much like the immediate post-World War II boom, where we see the franchises moving all over the place. It doesn't end up ruining sports, even though there are a lot of people in Brooklyn who will tell you it did. It just ends up changing them to make them something fundamentally new. And if we're moving into that era, I don't think that's something that we need to actively resist. I think that as fans, we need to always just make sure that we pay attention to how our favorite teams and leagues are run, and that in contests between the haves and the have-nots, that we as fans stay on the side of the have-nots, which in this case would be the players who are largely subject to those kind of things, whether it be NBA players, a predominantly black group playing in front of 20,000 upper middle class white people every night, or whether it be college football in the SEC, where 22 black players playing for free to entertain 90,000 white people screaming all around them. I think we need to make sure that even though they are the glorified stars and they are the ones who make all the money that we see, that we need to make sure that our fandom sides with those who need leverage in those kinds of negotiations. And as long as we do that, sports is going to change. Professional sports in all of the leagues is going to change, but it's going to create something new. It's not going to end everything altogether. And as long as we have the games, I think we'll be okay.
All right, always interesting conversations around these parts, and I learned a little fact. I did not know this, and frankly, had not seen that anywhere else, that the Minnesota Timberwolves were flirting with the idea of moving to New Orleans back in the day to possibly become the New Orleans Sinners, to become that the counterweight, if you will, to the Saints in the NFL, the Saints and the Sinners. That would have been really interesting. I had not seen that anywhere else. Please feel free to send information my way as to enlighten me further. But our thanks to Tom, not only for that little factoid, but also a great conversation and the book that you must get to fill in all the gaps that I missed, because we can only go so far for so long. It's called Dixieball. Came out 2019 or last year. I'm not sure. I forgot, but recently. It's called Dixieball, Race and Professional Basketball in the Deep South, 1947 to 1979. It is published by the University of Tennessee Press. And you can find it wherever good books are found. Of course, you can find a convenient link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. I believe it's number 244. And you will find a nice link to Amazon. You'll get it for the cheapest price and the quickest delivery. And you'll be giving us a couple of shekels of love by doing so, too, in a referential way. We appreciate that. You can follow Tom and his exploits at his website, thomasaiellobooks.com, Thomas Aiello, A-I-E-L-L-O, books.com. And you can also follow Professor Tom at on Twitter at Thomas Aiello. Again, Aiello is A-I-E-L-L-O, at Thomas Aiello. You can follow us on Twitter at Good Seats Still. And of course, our website, again, is goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where every stinking episode that we've ever done and likely ever to produce will be found. Of course, the best way to keep in touch and get all of our latest episodes, whether they be new or reincarnated or from the vaults, is our feed, wherever you might find it in podcast land. We're available just about everywhere you can listen to and or download and or otherwise consume podcasts. So just add us to your follows or your lists or your subscriptions, whatever it is you do, RSS feeds, whatever, we're out there. Find us and make sure we're on it, because we publish every week, God willing, and hopefully we don't want you to miss a single thing. You can follow us elsewhere on social media. We're on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available, and you'll find a little page devoted to us on Facebook as well. Good Seats Still Available there. You want to send us some email? Well, we welcome that, of course. Keep it clean and nice, hopefully positive, constructive criticism, certainly. But let's keep the vitriol down, shall we? We do our best, and we're not perfect. Hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And on our website, again, goodseatsstillavailable.com, you can find our little weekly email newsletter subscription button there. Just give us your name and your email address, and you will get our little weekly tip sheet as to what is going to transpire in the following week to come. Thank you all very much for listening. Of course, Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. Thank you, kind sir, for your efforts this week. And Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to all of our great listeners. We appreciate it. Hopefully more fun stuff coming your way. Stay tuned in the weeks ahead. Lots of great interviews coming up. Thanks again for your support, and until next week, we'll see you. Bye.